Welcome back to this continuation of our talk about the development of the English colonies. This presentation is really going to be a whirlwind because it's an attempt to try to say something specific about all the 13 colonies, where we've really only so far touched on a couple. We'll review some of that, but we'll see some further developments in places like Virginia and the New England colonies that we have talked about. But then there's a whole bunch of other English colonies we haven't really introduced at all. And this is my attempt to just gather them all quickly in this survey and know something about the character or characteristics of all of these 13 English colonies in North America. Now, because this is such a mishmash presentation about lots of different things, picking some sort of theme music was next to impossible. Hall and Oates, though, is one of my favorite bands, most successful duo in pop music history. I believe that's still true. It should still be true. So anything from Hall and Oates is good when I don't know what else to play. So you got a little sample from Hall and Oates. Well, let's get into things so that we can get through all 13 colonies here. As I mentioned, we have already had entire presentations just on Virginia. Or if you think about our presentation on Jamestown, that was the Virginia colony in its earliest days. And we have also talked about Massachusetts, not so much specifically Connecticut, New Hampshire, but we did talk about Rhode Island as well, these New England colonies. In this presentation, we will continue the story there a little bit, mainly by me just pointing you toward things in the book. And then we'll get into some other colonies as well. So let's back up to Virginia. What else happens in Virginia after 1620s, after these wars with Opichancanoughs and the last possibility of there being any kind of peaceful relations between the English colonists and the Native American population, the Powhatans? Well, one of the main developments that you'll read about, one of the main events, happens in the 1670s in Virginia, and it's called Bacon's Rebellion. Notice this in the text here. I know I have it highlighted in your reading guide. But Bacon's Rebellion was a fight within Virginia that became really complicated. It starts off as a frontier fight in the western parts of Virginia. So we've got people out here that are fighting against Native American groups, and they didn't do such a good job of discriminating and knowing which Native group they really against. Um, the colonists tended to kind of lump all Indians together under one name, one title. So they, if there were atrocities, if there had been things stolen or people killed by one tribe, they may lash out against a completely different tribe. But basically, this also morphed into a conflict between settlers in the western part of the colony and the east. People over here in the east were not really having Indian problems anymore in the 1640s, 50s, 60s, 70s. The native population has dwindled down to virtually nothing. And so it's more of a frontier problem, conflicts between English settlers and Native Americans. So colonists in the western part of the colony felt like those wealthy people in the East don't really care about our problems. The government over here in Williamsburg, that ended up being the home base, that was not, they're not responsive to things that are happening out in the West. So Francis Bacon was one of those leaders who's going to not only be fighting Indian tribes, but eventually turning his anger against the settled people of the East. What this also illustrates is that there were a lot of unhappy indentured servants who, when they serve their period of time, they're expecting they can become landowners. Well, the colony did still give land away, other Indians' land, but it might not be the choice lands right here along the East Coast and those most easily accessed by rivers and those that have the greatest chance for trade. No, the lands that indentured servants may finally end up with are lands out here in the frontier, lands that are um, not as profitable, maybe more in the hills and mountains of the Appalachians. So there is some real east-west tension here, and Bacon's rebellion is the prime example of that. We won't go into all the details here again because it's in the textbook, but you'll see that part of the outcome of this conflict, when the rebellion basically fizzled out after Nathaniel Bacon dies, but part of what this seemed to illustrate was the need, the preference for permanent slavery as opposed to indentured servanthood. Indentured servants are always going to want more land. They're going to want their rights when their term of service is over. And so Virginia had already been drifting more toward a system of permanent slavery. This is the confirmation that that's going to be much better economically and socially for the colony, to have this more racial definition of the labor force. Um, there'll still be tensions between East and West, but Bacon's Rebellion's the time it really brews over. Now, again, we did talk about Massachusetts. We didn't say something specifically about Connecticut, partly because it's not so different. Here's Massachusetts, and there was not a great split, but one of the main ministers in Massachusetts, his name is Thomas Hooker. Kind of a funny name for a minister now because we don't think of minister when we hear the name Hooker. But Thomas Hooker was a Puritan minister, as pure as they came, and he was the founder of a new colony, which would be part of Hartford, Connecticut. Another colony was established further south, actually on the coast there at New Haven, Connecticut. Those eventually get combined, and Connecticut was a separate colony, but still very much like what Massachusetts was. It's settled by Puritans. They're Calvinists. They believe in congregational worship. They're just as staunch, if not more so, Puritan than the folks in Massachusetts. So um, we just don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of specifics of Connecticut, how it might be distinct. And we could say the same with New Hampshire. New Hampshire ends up being its own separate colony too, but it's really just an expansion, a broadening out from Massachusetts. Some folks move further up into the mountains and into the woods here for commercial reasons. It's not because of a great church split or anything like that. And New Hampshire will have much of the same law, the same kinds of people as Massachusetts had. But it becomes its own colony as well. Rhode Island, now we did say a little something specific about this because the Rhode Island colony ended up being the place where Massachusetts sent their cast-offs. That's where Roger Williams fled to, and that's where Anne Hutchinson was initially banished to. Several Baptist leaders in Massachusetts, when they're going to confront other Congregationalists about the purpose of baptism, well, Rhode Island is the place to send these people. And Rhode Island does stand out in all of these New England colonies because it's the one place that had this broader definition of religious freedom. That meant there's not just one church that's legal in Rhode Island. There's really lots of different Christian churches there that are welcome. Remember, this is not because Roger Williams was a modern man who said, it doesn't matter how you worship. Oh, it certainly matters to him. But he thought, if the government gets involved, then church gets corrupted. So to him, it was best not to legislate about those things. He's going to definitely have his preferences. He does not like some of the groups that are going to come into Rhode Island. He can't stand Quakers. And yet, this is a place where Quakers are going to be free to move into. They're not welcomed in Massachusetts in the early 1600s. So Rhode Island does stand out among all these New England colonies because of the religious freedom that they offer. Baptists are welcomed, and people from all varieties of Christianity welcomed in Rhode Island. One other thing I should point out, the map kind of makes this clear. If you're just used to studying a map of the current U.S., you might think, well, what about Maine? We haven't said anything about the big colony of Maine. Well, Maine was not its own colony. Maine was just backwoods Massachusetts. Um, it was part of the Massachusetts colony, so it didn't have a separate identity. That's not going to happen until statehood in 1820. So one thing I will say, with all of these New England states in mind, Massachusetts to Rhode Island, one other big event that's kind of a continuation of the story there. We already talked about early establishment, John Winthrop, Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson. What happens there, though, in the 1670s is another Indian conflict, much like Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. Only this is more specifically just an Indian conflict. Um, all of these New England colonies get involved in what's called King Philip's War, or Metacom's War. Metacom was the chief of a tribe of Indians called the Wampanoag tribe. This was the first group that the Pilgrims encounter. And it's just been a couple of generations since the Pilgrims arrived. And initially, they had pretty decent relations with the Wampanoags. There was even a translator there, a native who had learned English language because he had been a captive of the English years earlier, even before the Pilgrims arrived. Um, and um, and so they had communication between the two and had much better relations than Virginia did with the Powhatans. But things had changed. The Wampanoags and other tribes could see that there's lots of English people and they just keep coming. And it's not just a few hundred, but it becomes thousands and thousands. And the native tribes were dwindling, not necessarily because of war, though sometimes there was war, more from just disease, exposure to these microbes that they'd never been exposed to before. So a couple of years, a couple of generations go by from that first contact with the Pilgrims, and now Metacom, the new leader, he's plotting for an attack on the English. Um, and he's willing to give up a bunch of land if the English will trade him guns. The plan is basically, we'll give away land for guns, and later we can use our guns to get back the land. But Metacom joins with other tribes as well, and there's this big war, 1675 and 76, called King Philip's War, or Metacom's War. King Philip was just a name that the English colonists called him, sometimes to make fun of him. Just, look at this Native American standing on a rock, acting like he's some sort of a king holding council. The English, of course, did not think of him as a king. They don't honor him as king. But this war certainly gets their attention. This was a very intense war, involves all of these colonies. And as far as just the population that was there, how many people are involved, this was as intense as any war in American history in that one local area. Well, the English do prevail. I'll let you read about it, but the English will finally prevail. And they will get help from some Indian tribes while they're fighting against others. But part of the result is going to be the selling off of a lot of these Indians that had fought against the English. Many of them will be sold in the Caribbean as slaves afterward. There were already some incidents, certainly, of hostility between the natives and the English, but King Philip's War makes things much more bitter, and more tension between the two. So there's a couple of continuation stories you'll find in the text. As we had talked about the establishment of Virginia, you'll see Bacon's Rebellion as a continuation decades later. And we've also talked about the establishment of the New England colonies. Now, King Philip's War is a big event that's happening decades later. Now, let's get into some new colonies. What stands out about Maryland? Um, I hope you've noticed already from the reading, Maryland stands out as one place that was designed to be a safe haven for Catholics. It's also the first colony that we would call a proprietary colony. So far, the colonies we've talked about were mainly business ventures, joint stock companies founded these colonies. But a proprietary colony is land that the king has given to a single individual or lots of individuals that are going to be proprietors there. It's like the king has given land and now says, you are the lord of this land. They haven't completely come out of medieval times. You are the lord of this land and you make the laws, you make the rules, you collect the taxes and distribute land however you want. Only, of course, you're still under the king. But the proprietor will be the lord of the land. Well, the proprietors in Maryland, you'll see them from a family, the Calvert family, George and Cecilius is a man, George and Cecilius Calvert, father and son. And um, they they bear the title Lord Baltimore. That's a good way to remember this too. Where's the city of Baltimore? Well, it's in the state of Maryland. Um, the Calvert family were English Catholics, still very well-to-do aristocrats in England, but they're one of the minority that had never converted to the Church of England or any other variety of Protestant. They're certainly not Puritans. They're faithful to the Catholic Church. But they were well off and they have connections with the king. So they are given land in the 1630s to create their own colony. Now, they're not going to be the residents there, they're going to be absentee landlords. But they see an opportunity to make this land a safe haven for fellow Catholics. Now, they can't go so far as to just say this is a Catholics only colony. That would be against English law. That would get them in trouble with the king. They would likely lose that proprietorship. So instead, what they're going to do is just welcome Catholics to go there. And eventually, there will be a law that says we have religious tolerance here. Protestants and Catholics can come and worship freely here. But the real intention is make sure that the Catholics are safe. So they will have a concentration of more Catholic presence there than any other colony. But if we continue this story a little ways, it's not long before the Protestants, of course, outnumber the Catholics. And the Protestant population there is not going to want to just honor Catholics' rights. Many Protestants, English Protestants, still saw Catholicism as something foreign. It's something alien to the English. It's more associated with Spain and hierarchy in Europe. It's what English people are not. So even though they have a law in the 1650s that grants religious toleration, by the 1680s and 90s, the Protestants will have full control and they'll make the Anglican Church the official church. But that's really glossing over this story here. But you should know something about the individual character of Maryland. Lord Baltimore, the Calvert family, they're in charge. Now, the next couple we can look at jointly because they started off joined together. In the 1660s, we have the establishment of the Carolinas. And Carolina was also a proprietary colony, only this is not given to one individual proprietor, it's given to 8 proprietors, friends of the king who will be given land to govern as their own. Now, part of what makes Carolina unique character, is many of these proprietors already had some experience with colonization. Many of them already owned land in the Caribbean. From this map, you don't see any Caribbean islands, but they already owned property, some of them, in places like Bermuda and Barbados, other English colonies. They had sugar plantations and rice plantations, things that would be very profitable in the Caribbean. In fact, more profitable really than all of these 13 colonies we focus on so much, because these become the United States of America. The Caribbean colonies were really the most profitable for the English. So what these proprietors do in the Carolinas is transplant the same kind of culture they have in Bermuda and in Barbados. They bring it to the Carolinas, especially down here in the southern part. Charleston or Charlestown is named for the king. This is um, King Charles II. Um, and most of their wealth is going to be accumulated in the southern part of Carolina. And they will have big populations of Africans they bring in to work these plantations. Again, they bring the same kind of culture they had in the Caribbean to the Carolinas. Um, very, very rough, very dangerous kind of work in the terrible heat, mosquito infested, swampy kinds of lands, but can be very profitable as you're making rice and indigo and sugar, um, but very short lifespan of those slaves living there. So part of what's unique in the southern part of Carolina, this was a place where there were more slaves than there were free people. And that was unique. There's a lot of slaves in other places. Virginia had more than anyone, but the white population was still larger than the slave population. Not so in Southern Carolina. The white population is actually outnumbered by the slave population. Now, Northern Carolina, eventually they split the two. The northern part didn't have as many, they certainly still have plantations, but they don't have as many big, profitable kinds of plantations that South Carolina had. They tended to have a lot of tobacco country here as well along the border with Virginia, just as Maryland does too. They grow a lot of tobacco initially. So North Carolina is the not quite as prosperous land, more smaller landowners, but the Carolinas have this unique character because these proprietors bring the kind of slave culture that already existed in the Caribbean. All these colonies had at least some slaves. There's a difference in a colony having slaves and really just having slave culture, where it is embedded in everything. Carolinas stand out in that regard. Now, other places, New York certainly has a unique story here because New York was originally a Dutch colony. It was the New Netherlands. So imagine here we've got the New England colonies established here. We've got Virginia and Maryland established in the Chesapeake Bay area. But between these sets of English colonies, here's a big open middle place where the Dutch actually had a colony. They're what we call New York City now, they called New Amsterdam. And what we call Albany, New York, is Fort Orange. These were places that the Dutch had established colonies. Now, the Dutch and the English had a lot of common ground and could often get along. They're both Protestant countries. They're both very commercial countries, even though they don't have enormous populations. They their merchants get around a lot. They trade all over the world. So sometimes they could be competitors as being commercial leaders in Europe, even if they share this religious connection as being two Protestant countries in Europe. But from time to time, they were at war with one another. And one of these times, the English just simply come and threaten to take over. The folks of New Netherlands are not really in a mood to fight. As long as they can be guaranteed, we still get to keep our land and we can still worship however we want. We can still have the Dutch Reformed Church. Then you can fly an English flag here. That doesn't really make much difference to us. Um, the the governor of this New Netherlands colony was very upset that fellow Dutchmen would not fight back. Um, you'll read about him in the text as well, Peter Stuyvesant. He wanted them to put up a fight. Don't let the English take them over. But the English take them over really without a fight. And it'll trade hands a couple of times because mostly the war between England and the Dutch is going on in the Atlantic, or it's going on back in Europe. But the colonies will feel um, some impact on this rivalry between the two. So New York already had this very cosmopolitan characteristic that it's got Dutch people. And the Dutch, by the way, are not just Dutch. People have moved from all over Europe to get to the Netherlands because, much like the Pilgrims had moved there, before they came to the New World, the Netherlands had the reputation of being the most liberal and open country in Europe, really in the world. So they already have a very multinational population. So New York didn't just become diverse in the 19th and 20th century, it became even more diverse. But even in colonial days, this was a land that there were dozens of languages spoken, English and Dutch and Swedish and French and German. People from all over had already lived in the New Netherlands. Now, I've just included New Jersey because it's somewhat just continuation here. I mentioned the Swedish, they had a colony a little further down this Delaware River. But in the interest of time, um, we'll lump some of these together. The reason New Netherlands becomes New York is because the king, King Charles II, gives this land to his brother and says, the Duke of York is now the proprietor of this land. And so Duke of York creates the colony of New York, really just a takeover of New Netherlands. Now, if I was going to pick just one other colony and do a whole lecture just on one, it would undoubtedly be Pennsylvania, because it also has very unique characteristics and a really interesting story. Pennsylvania is a proprietary colony and the largest that's given to a single individual. Pennsylvania was land given to William Penn, and the name means Penn's Woodlands. Only he's not really naming it after himself. That would be pretty egotistical of William Penn. He's naming it after his father, William Penn. It's Admiral Penn's Woodlands. Now, here's the story. Admiral Penn was an admiral in the British Navy, and he had served faithfully, regardless of changes in government. England had undergone a civil war in the 1640s that transferred leadership from king to just strictly parliament. And then by the 1660s, the kings are back. So Admiral Penn navigated these waters, chuckle, chuckle. He navigated these waters by being a good admiral, both when it's purely under parliamentary control and when the Stuart kings come back into control. And the Stuart family never forgot that he was loyal to them, and they certainly appreciated his loyalty. The Duke of York, the man who will eventually be James II, he especially appreciated Admiral Penn because sometimes in the past, Penn took the blame for things that really could have just been the prince or the duke's fault. So the Stuart kings know they do owe a lot to this family. However, the son, William Penn, he goes off to college and does some very rebellious things. He goes to Oxford and he joins a religious group called the Quakers, or the official name, the Society of Friends. Now, that was a rebellious thing to do because the Friends were not really accepted and welcomed in English society, certainly not among the well-to-do Friends of the King kind of society. Quakers mainly attracted people from the lower rungs of society, people who were outcasts already. The founder of this religious group was named George Fox. And Fox had, uh, like a lot of Puritans, been uh, dissatisfied with the Protestant Reformation in England. He thought the Anglican Church is not satisfactory. That's not what real Christianity is supposed to look like. But he didn't really fall in with other Puritans as well. He sort of searched for lots of different answers, and finally he had this eureka moment where he believed, aha, the real truth of the matter is God already resides within. God's Spirit is already within all of us. We have the inner light of God's Spirit within us. And so the duty of all mankind is just to get in touch with that inner light, listen to God's voice from within, and follow it. That's the essence of the Society of Friends. Now, they still consider themselves, a Christian group, but this is a Christian group that did not place as much emphasis on the biblical text, because to them, the Bible is just a record of other people having God speak through them, God working in them. God is still within each one of us, the Quakers say. And so listen to your own inner light. Yes, of course, you can read the Bible as well, but that doesn't supersede what God is saying in you now. This name Quakers really comes because in their meetings, they would just gather together in total silence until someone was moved or quaked to their feet to speak. And it was as if, the Spirit is moving them and now speaking for them. This is not, the Quakers are not like a very Pentecostal kind of group. I'm not suggesting that kind of quaking, faith healing and things like that. But they did believe God's voice is within, God's inner light is within. And, if you really get in touch with that, then you can finally stand and speak confidently. And it's as if it's the words of God, it's His Spirit speaking through you. Well, you can see why Quakers and Puritans might clash. Um, the Puritans put a lot of emphasis on education and understanding the Word of God. They do not tolerate someone saying, but God told me this, something separate, a newer revelation. Puritans don't stand for that. And the Quakers think Puritans make too much of the Bible. They make it an idol or a God of its own. So there's definitely conflict between those two outcast groups. Well, again, William Penn joins the Quakers, and what's most controversial is that he has joined them, and as the son of an admiral, it's really controversial because the Quakers are pacifists. They don't believe in war. They don't believe in supporting war. So here, this military son, William Penn, has joined with this notorious pacifist group who also agitates people because they speak differently. Um, they called everyone by um, they called everyone. They would address them as you instead of using these and thous. Um, they I know it sounds a little bit backwards. We might think of thee and thou as being more formal. They thought of it as being less formal actually back then, and so Quakers wanted to treat everyone the same. They're going to use the thee and thou for everyone. I think I said that backwards just a moment ago. They're going to use thee and thou for everyone instead of um, having a classification addressing wealthy people in one way and common people another way. The same thing with the way they wear their hats. It was common custom, common courtesy in England to take off your hat when you pass a real aristocrat, a real um, well-to-do person. Um, the Quakers just keep the hat on for everyone. They don't give hat honor to anyone. So this definitely gets them on the wrong side of English ruling class. Okay, so William Penn, he's joined this group of Quakers, and later um, King Charles II, he's the one granting a lot of these proprietary colonies. He has this idea for establishing a colony, which will really solve a couple of problems. He can pay the debt he owes to the Penn family by saying, "Here, William Penn, your father has passed away, but I'm giving you this huge chunk of land, and now I don't owe your family anything anymore." But it can also be helpful to the king because it will mean a lot of Quakers leave his country. They'll go to this New World colony, and William Penn is happy to accept. Um, Now, William Penn, because he is an aristocratic man, he had been involved in a proprietary portion of um, New Jersey. It had been split into an East and West Jersey, and he was, a part owner of some of that for a while. But he's really excited about having this bigger opportunity to form his own more model kind of colony in Pennsylvania. So with the Puritans, we talked about the city upon a hill idea of John Winthrop. Well, now in Pennsylvania, William Penn wants to put Quaker principles in place in this colony. But the way he's going to do that is going to be a little different than other colonies. To him, Quaker principles would not allow you to just say, "This is a Quakers only place. You must join the Society of Friends and worship the way we do." No, that would be un-Quaker like. Quakers had been so persecuted in England and in New England, they were not going to force anyone to join their religious groups. So instead, they're going to have religious freedom. And William Penn will advertise his colony as, the freest place for people to leave. So he can advertise all over Europe. If you are an oppressed religious group somewhere in Europe, if you just don't fit in because your country happens to be all Catholic or all Lutheran, all Calvinist, you don't fit any of those categories, you can come to Pennsylvania and you're welcome. You can have land and worship as you please. Pennsylvania is going to have religious freedom, more so than any place else, thanks to William Penn. Um, Another way that William Penn wants to put Quaker principles in place is by the way they treat Indians. He wants to make sure that they actually buy the land from Indians and don't just have it because a king happened to say all of this belongs to William Penn. Because Quakers also believe Indians have this inner light too. All human beings have God within them already, even if they've never heard of Jesus Christ, even if they don't know anything about the Bible, they have that inner light and they're deserving of dignity. So Pennsylvania has different relations with Native Americans. Now, while that is admirable, we could also say, could it also be because this is the 1680s by the time this is getting established? There's already been major wars, for decades in these other areas. Certainly Virginia and New England have had time for big native conflicts for decades. So, Pennsylvania does seem to be a safe haven, even for Indians running away from conflict north and south of them. But Quaker, I should have mentioned that Penn called this whole plan his holy experiment. You see that term, the holy experiment. That's the Quakers' way of saying we're putting Quaker principles in place in this colony, and we're going to become the model of what colonies should be like. Now, Penn initially was given not only Pennsylvania, but this little sliver of land here, Delaware, was just the lower counties of the land he had been given. But Delaware was also part of this Swedish colony along the Delaware River, and Penn separates it from the rest of the colony. He governs it separately. So it's another one we can pair together, but Delaware and Pennsylvania had a similar start. Now, if my count is accurate, that just leaves one left. Georgia is the 13th of our 13 colonies, and they too have an interesting, unique story. Each one of these, of course, would be worth much more attention. I do teach a whole course just on colonial America, and we spend a semester on this, so you're getting just the snapshots here. Georgia comes quite a bit after all the other colonies in the 1730s, so a good 50 years after all the other English colonies are established. And it's not really a proprietary colony. It's more of a humanitarian effort that some leaders in Parliament come up with, especially one member of Parliament named James Oglethorpe. That's the name you should most associate with Georgia. And his name is all over Georgia if you happen to travel through it. James Oglethorpe. Well, Oglethorpe thought Georgia, named for, now we've got a King George, he thought this land could be very useful as a colony because, for one thing, it will protect all these other colonies from Spanish presence in Florida. So, for one thing, they need a military buffer zone here to keep the Spanish from just encroaching up through the English colonies. But Oglethorpe also thought it's a problem in England that a lot of people just languish in jail because they can't pay their debts. They're English debtors just rotting in jail. Oglethorpe thought instead of just being punished in jail because you can't pay your debts and being useless to people there, why don't we put those people in service to their kingdom, put them in service to England, and have them move to Georgia? Let those English debtors serve purpose here. Oglethorpe had other big plans. He hoped that Georgia would be a major silk producer. He's looking for ways that they can import silkworms and compete with China for the development of silk. I thought it had just the perfect climate for silkworms and that kind of production to grow. He also had plans that this is going to be a different kind of colony than anywhere else. This is going to be a colony of just small farmers, no huge plantations. 50 acres of land, that's the most that anyone can own. And he also hoped that this would be a place where there's no slavery. No one owns slaves and no alcohol. It'll be completely dry. Well, these are some of the visions or dreams that James Oglethorpe had, but they're not exactly the dreams of all the residents there. The folks of Georgia look to the north and they see how prosperous South Carolina is. And of course, many of them want the plantations that they have. They don't want to be limited to 50 acres only, a relatively small farm. They want the big plantations if they can get it. They want slaves to work on those plantations. They don't want to have that prohibition of no slaves. And they certainly wanted the alcohol too. So there's quite a bit of tension here between what some leaders of a colony want and what the actual residents there want and insist on. And in fact, if you know, if you can look a little bit ahead in American history, you'll know Georgia becomes very much like South Carolina. It's not going to be a colony characterized by just small farms and no slavery. It's going to have big plantations and a slave culture there as well. They're just several decades behind South Carolina getting it started, but they are very much going to be a part of that slave culture. So again, this is a very brief look at all of these colonies, but what an interesting variety of the English colonies. And one of the big things you should notice is that other than granting some land to proprietors, the king is not really at the center of all this. Every colony is pretty free to develop its own characteristics based on either the proprietor in charge there or a joint stock company that started the colony. There's quite a bit of variety in these English colonies. Now, some common themes I have already addressed, but hopefully will make a little more clear now. Um, Religion is a major theme, religious character and purpose of many of these colonies. Um, Now, I think we have to be careful, and we can't really say, you see, all of these English colonies were established for the purpose of religious freedom. Of course, we can't say that. You have to be very specific about where you're talking about, when you're talking about. Now, some do stand out. Of course, the New England colonies had a religious purpose. They are part of a company, but those Puritans want to establish a model Christian society. Um, but they're not going to tolerate others with a different vision of what that model ought to look like. Um, Rhode Island ends up being the place with the most religious freedom there, but not really because Roger Williams believes in total religious freedom. He just knows anytime government gets involved in religion, it corrupts the religion. For other places of religious freedom, we might look to Maryland or we look to Pennsylvania, to some extent the Carolinas as well. But we can't really just say, you see, all these English colonies were started with a religious purpose. Many of them were, but we have to be much more specific when we talk about that. Um, Definitely a major theme. You could go on and on about how the ideals of the colony don't always match the reality. Um, Massachusetts, city upon a hill, did not stay as purely united, working as one man as John Winthrop had hoped. Um, and Georgia certainly does not follow the ideals of its founder, James Oglethorpe. It's very rarely did someone's ideals actually get carried through in reality in the colony. Um, Sadly, war with Indians was a common theme, and we've just barely scratched the surface talking about a few of these um, wars with Powhatan's or Bacon's rebellion in Virginia, um, Metacom's war in New England, the Carolinas and Georgia, everywhere still had Indian war. Even in Pennsylvania, there will be conflict there as well. Um, and Another common theme would be that there's challenges for governing all of these colonies. Even William Penn, which you see in this lower picture, this is supposed to be William Penn, um, communicating to the Indians that he is going to be much more tolerant. He wants to get along with them. He's not going to push them off of their land, but he'll be very fair in these transactions. Well, William Penn still had governing challenges in Pennsylvania. He was still the lord or the proprietor of that land. And he didn't live there all the time. He'd come and check on Pennsylvania, but then he went back and lived in England and checked on his land holdings in Ireland as well. He's from an aristocratic family. Um, but his people in Pennsylvania often refuse to pay their taxes. He wants to make money on the colony, but many of them resent um, his um, his money making scheme. They might want to do things their own way, and so they want the land without having to pay for it. And they're not really going to be total owners of the land; they're just constantly paying him rent. So there's often a conflict, even from a benevolent proprietor like William Penn. There's often conflict between the proprietor and the actual residents. Um, Folks of Pennsylvania, they wanted um, more control of government themselves and not just from this great lord who's absent. We could point out many other common themes, I'm sure, but just in this quick sweep of 13 colonies, these few come to mind. Finally, if you break these colonies into certain groups, a cluster of groups, you can find certain regional distinctives. The southern colonies, if we start here kind of from Maryland, Chesapeake Bay area and down, the thing that stands out most are these are the colonies where slavery was more important. Again, slavery was legal in all of the colonies. Every colony had some slaves, but they were never central to the economy. They're never a big part of New England's economy. They are central to growing tobacco in Maryland and Virginia. They're certainly central to culture in the Carolinas and eventually in Georgia too. Um, Now, we might call everything in between here, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York. This is the middle colonies. Well, this is the most um, multicultural of all of these areas. This is the area that already had the English, the Dutch, the Swedish, French, German, and of course, Pennsylvania is going to welcome more and more diverse populations to move there as well. Um, it's the most diverse. It's the place that's going to be growing a lot of grain. It'll be the breadbasket of all of these colonies. So that's probably what stands out most for them. And New England, of course, has its Puritan stamp on them that makes them most regionally distinctive. Doesn't mean that they're all going to be united religiously. There will be more and more conflicts among the Puritans, as we'll see. But certain Puritan qualities are um, shaping all of these colonies. That included not only um, the desire for Puritan worship and more autonomy, just like they want every congregation to be autonomous. It also means creativity in hard work. They live in a pretty harsh land to get a lot of things to grow. There's a lot of really rocky soil here. But those Puritans were pretty um, ingenuitive in trying to figure out how they can still profit from their surroundings. You know, it's cold a lot of the year. It ices over much of the year. But those Puritans will figure out ways to sell ice that comes out of their lakes. They can sell ice to the people in the Caribbean. Or they've got a lot of trees. They've got a lot of timber here. Um, they'll sell a lot of wood, and in fact, they'll use a lot of sawdust from that wood to insulate ice that they're shipping to the much warmer Caribbean. So New England colonies have a lot of distinctive characteristics as well, religious and just in the character of what we would later call the Yankees, a Yankee merchant spirit, pretty good at making a living out of whatever circumstances happen to be around you. Okay, I believe that just about does it for what I wanted to share here. I look forward to seeing how you do on this information, and I'll give you more on this very soon. So until next time, bye.